And it is a great privilege to be once again, after some time, at the Graduate Institute here in Geneva. I will spend most of my time today by analyzing the huge difficulties of Europe, because I think we need to overcome standard, conventional explanations of why Europe is in difficulty, if we want really these difficulties one day to be surmounted. And now I will be presumptuous, but I do believe that Europe, the European Union rather, has a double duty to overcome its evident crisis of the last few years. One is to itself, to its citizens, and to those who gradually built the European Union. But the other one, however ludicrous it might appear at this very time, is a duty that the EU has to the world. Because I'm still convinced that no better system of governance of globalization has been invented so far than the one which has presided over a rather successful process of governance of globalization at the continental scale for 60 years. I am not sure I would go all the way to the title of the recent paper or book even of Professor Moravich, "The EU, not China, is the superpower of the 21st century." I'm not sure, but it is interesting that normally non-European observers keep a lot of faith in this ability to co-govern a process of integration. I think I will briefly deal with two aspects this evening, and then, as always, I'm sure the most lively and interesting part will be the Q&A that you will chair. I will first say why I do fear a process of disintegration in Europe. And then I will say what, in my view, needs to be remedied for Europe's economic governance not to contribute itself to this process of disintegration, but rather resume a positive contribution to the life of the European community. You will discover immediately that I dare to venture into territories of political science, but of course I'm not a political scientist. I used to be an economist, and then the practical acquaintance with applied policies and even politics probably has reduced my real sound knowledge of economics without compensating that with an appropriate and well-shaped knowledge of politics. But at any rate, I will tell you very candidly what my fear about European disintegration is. First of all, it's not a phenomenon starting today or in the last couple of years. In my analysis, the first symptoms of fatigue for integration in Europe go back to the early years of the 2000s, when, let's take two very different levels in our society. At the mass public opinion level, the referendum on the constitutional treaty in France and the Netherlands was negative, and the concern which was expressed by the French voters was basically the concern about free movement, which was okay when there were a few of us, but which perceived to have become dangerous after an enlargement that many of them thought had been too quick. This was concentrated in the syndrome of the Polish plumber that alarmed so much the French middle class. But at the top of the corporate community, the community that has always been very hot on pursuing European integration, how can we forget that around 2002, 2003, those very CEOs who had been pushing for more European integration became scared because European integration was becoming too serious. With the efforts of the European Commission in 2002 to produce a directive on takeovers that was aiming at really creating a single market in Europe, not just for goods and services, but also for the dearest thing of all to corporate hearts, corporate control. And then the CEOs who had campaigned for the single market went to see their heads of governments and said, particularly in one of the languages of the EU, attention, which is not a Finnish word. Hostile takeovers might become a bit too easy. But now, coming to today, of course, the effect of the financial crisis first and the economic and social and political crisis, which began with Lehman Brothers, plus the tensions because of the financial crisis within the Eurozone, plus the more recent phenomena about refugees and migrants, have created really a state of visible risk of disintegration. The disintegration, I fear, is not a disintegration through separation. I do not believe that ultimately Greece will leave the Eurozone, nor that the UK will leave the European Union. I will leave with that asserted dogmatically, and perhaps during the debate we can develop a bit that point. But what I fear is worse than that. That is a disintegration through implosion, through detachment between the Europeans and what used to be their European Union. And we see so many symptoms of that, and that is part of a greater and broader detachment between citizens and institutions and elites. Invariably, I think in all countries, the degree of confidence in the European Union has gone down over the last few years, but still remains higher than the degree of confidence in national institutions. Both went down. Where I differ, where I am in a clear minority, I believe, is in assessing the causes of this obvious malfunctioning of the European Union. I share the view of those, normally politicians from the member states, or heads of governments or ministers from the member states, who say there is a political crisis in Europe. There is a vacuum of political Europe. They go on saying there is too much bureaucracy, technocracy, bureaucracy, all those things. And I, in part, agree. And I also see the adjective political and the noun Europe and their uneasy combination at the source of the problems that we have. Except that in my analysis, the politics which is responsible is vastly politics at the national level. Where is Europe, where is politics at the EU level? Well, there is the European Parliament, there is the European Commission, which in the Juncker incarnation, following the wish of many national leaders, has become more political itself. One can issue various notes or judgments or criticisms or applauses towards the Parliament and the Commission, but I don't believe that it is really there, the problem. They are not very different from what they used to be. If anything, actually, the Parliament has gained powers and has become a bit less lenient to national positions and considerably more expressing a European view. And I believe that the Commission is doing its job rather well. But what is the place for politics in Europe, in Brussels at the top? That is a body called the European Council. The European Council, which meets by now almost every month, and which takes or fails to take the most important decisions about the life of Europe. It is the European Council, composed, as you know, of the 28 heads of governments of the member states, which takes the decisions. And they are supposed to be decisions in the general interest of Europe. But if we examine the pattern of the decision-making, and even more visibly the pattern of the announcements, the communication done already at the very end of the meeting, and then the following days by each national leader, we can clearly see that, with a few exceptions from time to time, but there are 28 ladies and gentlemen taking decisions on behalf of Europe, but guided by national political considerations. National, are they simply guided by national interests? That would not be ideal in a European community, but I think it would still be decent, because in my view, in the long term, the national interest of most of our member states tends to coincide with a strong Europe. Problem is that they tend to decide and then to communicate on the basis of national, in the sense of non-European, but political interests. And just as the political systems are becoming, in Europe, and not only in Europe, more and more short-term oriented, as if politicians had been contaged by the financial markets, where through more regulation, they have more or less succeeded in reducing to some degree the short-termism of financial markets. But in the process, they have become more short-termist themselves. And the national political considerations, very often national party considerations, have an horizon which if we are optimistic, reaches the next election. If we are realistic, extends to the next poll, which is normally next week. And the strength of prime ministers, particularly in coalition governments, or the strength of prime ministers leading parties which are large enough to be not so cohesive internally, depends very, very much on how that summit went for him or for her. We are in a wonderful example of architecture here. I believe that we can use an architectural metaphor because for years and years, the national governments, their heads, have been going to Brussels, bringing each time their brick for the construction of the European house. They looked at Europe as an investment, knowing that in the long term it was the thing to do for each of us to be more prosperous and more secure. Now, I'm afraid most of them view the EU as a wonderful consumption good. They go in the not so nice architecture of Brussels. They take a brick each time. They try to, I don't think that there is the word pulverize, but I use it nevertheless, to pulverize the brick, to transform it in powder, hopefully a magic powder, in order to create national consensus on them. So this is the use of the European Union as a consumption good. I'm not a political scientist, but I observe that this increasing short-termism tends to take place everywhere in democratic systems, which I continue to largely prefer relative to non-democratic systems to dispel any, technocrats may be dangerous. We have this phenomenon which tends to be associated with nationalism and with populism, not only in Europe, even in, now I don't remember the name of a very, very large country west of Europe, where some signals of these phenomena are, with an appropriate lens, discernible at this time. So there is this short-termism, not only in the sense of the horizon of decision-making, so that little by little we are all as if we were conspiring to leave to one country in this world the exclusivity of deciding for the long term, a slightly less democratic country, the People's Republic of China. But it's not only the horizon of decision-making that shortens and shortens in our systems, but it is also the horizon and the style of the political debate, if you think of it. The 140 characters of a tweet. Slogans in TV debates, which if they exceed 10 or 15 seconds, people are bored. And if you have to convince people that you need a protectionist solution, for example, 5 or 6 seconds are sufficient to win at first sight the mind and heart of somebody to whom you say, we have so high unemployment because we are not competitive, let's close our frontiers to foreign goods. Less than 10 seconds. If you need to make the case for integration, for non-protectionism, you need to go into the indirect effects, into the long-term effects, and you have to present cases drawn for economic history, and you're lost. And when people say we only need in Europe to have once again the fortunate combination of a Kohl and a Mitterrand at the same time, this is not going to happen, unless by accident, because our political systems are no longer fit to produce those personalities. Integration is hit more or less everywhere, and the WTO here in Geneva would probably be the first one to say that since a few years it's a difficult life, no longer with the wind, but against the wind, except that if integration hits everywhere the world, in the European Union, which is based fundamentally on integration, it's a particularly serious fight, which in my view is not a lost fight, but if we allow that the EU and the political level of the EU simply offers the other, is ready to be, engages in a self-flagellation to be complacent to the criticisms of national leaders, then we are only going to worsen the situation. But there are a few things, and here I come to the second and much shorter part of my remarks, that the EU, alas, with the help of national leaders, can do to trigger a more positive dynamic vis-à-vis the European Union, particularly by triggering a more positive economic tendency in Europe. And here I come to those parts in which I am supposed to be slightly more competent, and that's why I will almost skip this part, which maybe will come up later. I don't believe that there are enormous changes to be introduced to the governance of the European economy. But a few changes, yes. And so far, under the impact of crisis, those changes have been introduced when necessary. I had the privilege of being at the forefront of the days and nights when the European Council and the summit of the Eurozone in 2011, 2012, with my country being risking to be the detonator of, in that case, an explosion, not an implosion of the Eurozone. I saw step by step, and I tried to contribute to some of these steps, how the governance can be improved. Even in those aspects which are sanctified by correctly stating the autonomy of certain agencies. I have seen in place and have tried to contribute to a very virtuous interaction between the political body of Europe, the European Council, and the independent European Central Bank, when after very difficult and strong negotiations, we arrived on the 29th of June of 2012 at 4 a.m. At an agreement which was very, very much resisted by Germany, the Netherlands, and Finland, which stated for the first time that if a country does everything that is required by the country-specific recommendations, the other guidelines, etc., and yet it experiences an unduly high spread in the market, that may have to do with the risk premium demanded by the markets on the euro-denominated instruments at a time when the euro was under risk of being somewhat disintegrated, with Greece or others going out. Well, even the super hawk and the two sub-hawks of Europe finally were persuaded that it would have been very detrimental for the life of the euro if they had not agreed that in those circumstances, and there you find the necessary combination for Europe to be able to move, because there was the moral aspect of Nordic and Protestant Europe, sorry, i.e., but only for those countries who deserve it, because they are doing what is requested of them. But then the more lenient element of some interventions to stabilize in the market. Who else could do the interventions? The ECB. And after that night, a few weeks down the road, the president of the ECB, with his supreme skill in communication and action, did first the whatever it takes statement, and then put in place the OMT, the outright monetary transactions, that was the instrument exactly embodying the statement of that night, an instrument which was so good that it calmed down the markets even though it has never been used. Okay. So economic governance can be improved, and it was improved under the crisis in this and many other respects. I don't believe that, for one, I don't believe that we can expect much more from monetary policy now, definitely not. Otherwise, we will end up with a culture in the public opinion of our countries which really believes that monetary expansion can create growth. And I see a few people here who probably, like me, would not be convinced that this is a perennial truth, although it is a perennial temptation. But I do see a huge need for a more investment-friendly fiscal policy in Europe. I see this at the level of the EU, and that takes the name of the Juncker Plan, both for public trans-European investment and also to trigger through interesting financial mechanisms more private investment and public-private investment. But we cannot forget that the present structure of the fiscal discipline rules plays against public investment at the national level, because it does not distinguish sufficiently, in my view, between expenditure of governments for current consumption and for sound public investment. I know that it is far from easy to define exactly what is a worth investment, an investment worth doing, but I'm sure that it is possible to agree at the European level, even in a very, very restrictive and limited sense, that certain categories of investment would fill this requirement, and it would be better than nothing. And here the Germans have to give in. I know that I'm always considered in Italy to be exceedingly pro-German. But sometimes German thinking in more than one area tends to become exceedingly self-confident when it finds itself in a clear minority. And I'm glad that the German economic philosophy still is convinced, unlike many Anglo-Saxon views, that economics is still a branch of moral philosophy, and that growth is the reward for sound moral economic behavior. But it is immoral vis-à-vis future generations in the framework of a former distinguished scholar of this institute, Röpke, and the Soziale Marktwirtschaft. It is immoral vis-à-vis future generations when interest rates are so low as today for a government not to borrow in order to endow the future generation with more appropriate quantities and qualities of social capital endowment to increase production and productivity of the country, the cost of which would currently be, for a country like Germany, 0.5%, and under whatever estimate, the internal rate of return on the projects implemented with the finance taken up for free would be considerably higher. So I think that, in my view, the time has come no longer to play so much with the notion of flexibility, so dear to many of Southern Europeans, which can be a real problem for the European Commission, in my view, because if you exercise flexibility, then invariably somebody will tell you that you have been more flexible with large countries than with small countries and things like that. And I know that Nordic ears perceive the word flexibility coming from southern mouths as if it meant don't believe that we will stick really to the rules. I think we need better rules and then a stricter adherence to those better rules without much flexibility. And the importance of rules is great in the European Union because it's not pure technocracy or dogmatic formalism, but the value of rules in a community like the European Union is huge. You cannot, over time, say that after all the fiscal discipline rules can afford not to be implemented flexibly because they are not really clever rules. By so doing, you undermine the value of rules in the European space. And then what happens about the rules for competition or for the single market, which are also implemented and enforced, often with huge confrontation and difficulties? But in those areas, the Commission does follow the instrument of law, and anybody is free to go to the European Court of Justice if they do not agree. A more greater orientation to investment, both at the national level, but also both at the EU level, but also at the national level through a reconsideration of the Stability Pact. And finally, I'm working on this, by the way, on behalf of the three European institutions. I believe that now, particularly now that member states, for the first time since many, many years, are going to Brussels and tell them, look, this is a problem for you, not for us. The protection of the external frontier, or the treatment of refugees or migrants, because they realize it's something that can be done, if anything, only at the EU level. So for the first time, member states are sort of defining new own functions for the EU, wouldn't it be natural that with new own functions would go also some new own resources, hence the problem of the EU budget? So I'm very critical about developments in Europe now. I hope I've given you, however, the impression that that is by no means a good reason to stop fighting. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Nous avons un moment pour des questions, en français ou en anglais. Qui veut commencer?
Bonsoir, merci pour votre présentation. J'ai 2 questions. D'abord, vous avez dit que vous pensiez que le Parlement avait plus de pouvoir politique, enfin de plus en plus. Et ça m'a un peu étonnée parce que je pensais aux dernières élections et au fait que maintenant, un quart des parlementaires européens sont eurosceptiques. Et aussi par rapport au fait que la fatigue de l'intégration date du début des années 2000 et elle concerne plus par exemple la liberté de mouvement, parce que c'est peut-être une perspective un peu française, je suis française. Et moi j'ai eu l'impression aussi qu'il y a un rejet de l'intégration qui se cantonne à l'économie et pas forcément à d'autres aspects qui seront plus communément admis comme positifs au sein de l'Union européenne, comme les droits de l'homme ou la protection de l'environnement, par exemple. Voilà.
Pouvez-vous répéter donc vous avez l'impression que ce n'est pas tant sur la liberté de mouvement qu'en sur...
Le libéralisme plutôt que économique, en fait.
Oui. Ah oui.
Vous voulez prendre plusieurs questions?
Comme vous voulez.
Ici.
Hello. Here. So thank you very much. I think it was very interesting, and I have a question regarding the EU economic governance. So I agree with you that there are not many things to change, but I think the one thing we must change is the participation of the people, so the so-called democratic deficit. Because I think one of the problems now that in many European countries we have is that our economic governance is not accountable to people. So don't you think that that will be the main issue to convince people to stay together in a better, a stronger European Union?
Hi, I just wanted to find out what's your opinion and how do you perceive the changes, the political changes in Poland and Hungary, and if it's a reason for European disintegration, and what should the European Union do about that?
Vous voulez répondre à ces 3 questions?
Je vais essayer. Sur le Parlement européen, je crois, comme je l'ai dit, que les pouvoirs du Parlement européen ont été accrus. Et la dernière fois, à l'occasion du traité de Lisbonne. Et ils ont été aussi exercés en fait, pas seulement octroyés en droit. Il est vrai, comme vous le dites, Madame, qu'un tiers maintenant au Parlement est composé de groupes qui ne sont pas pro-intégration européenne, ou certains d'entre eux vous diraient qu'ils sont pro-Europe forte, mais pas tout à fait celle qu'on a aujourd'hui. Vous introduisez un jugement de valeur dans votre... ce qui est parfaitement légitime, mais je ne crois pas qu'on puisse dire qu'un Parlement n'est pas monté en puissance simplement parce que sa composition empêche à ce moteur de produire toute l'énergie qu'il pourrait, parce que je ne sais pas si vous comprenez mon point de vue, mais effectivement, cette composition paralyse un peu, ou pour mieux dire, a eu l'effet de créer une grande coalition parmi les trois principaux groupes, les populaires, les socialistes et les libéraux, en mettant un peu à l'écart les autres. Sur votre deuxième point, oui, je sais qu'en France, en France, jusqu'il y a peu d'années, les aspects marché libre, ouvert, concurrentiel se traduisaient dans l'expression néolibéralisme anglo-saxon, pour en utiliser une assez souple et douce. Et donc, je comprends bien que de votre point de vue, vous identifiez une raison du rejet de la part des Français du projet d'intégration sur ce point-là. Et vous touchez à quelque chose que je considère extrêmement important, mais pour le dire plus rapidement, je le dis en anglais. I believe that in Europe we need a big deal, a big compromise between the social and the market components of the social market economy, which in the Lisbon Treaty is defined to be the template of Europe. Because we have, particularly in continental Europe, in the Eurozone, in the largest members of the Eurozone, still more corporatism and less flexibility in markets than there are in countries like the UK or Ireland or the Nordic or the Eastern countries. And I believe that it is very difficult, but if we want to be a highly competitive social market economy as pretended by the Lisbon Treaty, we need to reconcile more the market and the social aspects. In my view, the big compromise, which so far has not even been attempted, would be to insist, I mean, with sticks and legal instruments for countries like, why not, your own, to accept more than they tend to do now free market and competition. But for countries like the UK to accept, if they stood in the EU, to accept more than they ever did the notion not of tax harmonization to the extreme, but of some tax coordination. Otherwise, it's easy to say that the single market, in fact, unparalleled by some tax coordination, means big tax competition, which favors the mobile factors of production, like capital or enterprises, relative to labor, and therefore erode the tax basis on which member states can exercise some redistribution. So it would be a long and complicated aspect, but I would love to see one day this problem put on the table. On democratic governance, why didn't I say that the biggest gap is, on economic governance, that the biggest gap is the democratic deficit? I think there is a democratic deficit. I must say, even, however, at the level of member states, I've seen myself the relatively low degree of practical involvement of national parliaments in some key aspects of national policy making. And the trend, however, is that, for example, when there was the so far last episode of the Greek drama in May, June, July last year, the European Parliament invited the Prime Minister Tsipras to go to Strasbourg, and there was a political debate with the Parliament. I think that even some finance ministers now are ready to see that without leaving to parliaments, to the European Parliament, the last word, there has to be more public debate about crucial policy decisions, and that the European Parliament is probably the place to have that. Finally, on Poland and Hungary, I still believe it was an excellent idea, an historical need to have that reunification of Europe. And I'm still convinced that it had to be done rather quickly, as it was done. Many observers now criticize that the incorporation of the new member states has been too fast. I always wonder, given the features of the Putin governance of Russia, if the EU had not decided to take on board those countries by May 2004, would we feel much more secure and more comfortable if countries from Slovenia to Estonia and all in between were still to be in a grey zone of applicant countries to the EU? Certainly, however, I am greatly discomforted by what has happened recently in terms of elections and actual behavior of some governments there, but we believe in democracy. But it is true that there are rules, Article 7 in the treaty, which put some limit to the arbitrary way of interpreting certain human rights.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. Vous avez parlé beaucoup d'économie, vous êtes un économiste et je le comprends très bien. Il y a une chose, comment motiver un Européen moyen, comme je le suis, en ne me parlant que de budget sheets, en ne me parlant que de problèmes monétaires, etc. L'Europe est quand même un ensemble de populations qui a une culture, une histoire culturelle, des langues, des éducations multiples, extrêmement importantes, et on n'en entend presque jamais parler. Ça, c'est ma première part de la question. La seconde, c'est je n'entends que très rarement parler les autorités européennes elles-mêmes. Mon petit moineau déplumé, M. Van Rompuy, je ne l'ai jamais entendu parler. Étant belge, je l'ai entendu parler quand il était Premier ministre. Il parlait un français très brillant. Mais je ne l'entendais jamais parler. Pourquoi ces gens ne parlent pas? Jean-Claude, actuellement, il ne parle pas. On ne l'entend pas. Alors, ce problème de motivation de l'Européen moyen, je crois que tous les problèmes que vous avez élaborés ces temps-ci, aujourd'hui, ça les dépasse. Et vous avez bien mentionné à un moment donné qu'il y a deux niveaux. Il y a le niveau décisionnel bruxellois. Comme disait M. Cameron, I hate Brussels, I'm here to defend my country. Ça aussi, ce n'est pas une motivation. Voilà, c'est un peu une impression plus qu'une question.
Presidente, grazie per l'intervento. I have two quick questions. I'm here. The first one is about the Schengen Treaty and the Schengen Zone. Right now, I think 9 countries have resorted to closing the borders. And it doesn't seem to be something temporary, particularly given the numbers of refugees arriving in Southern Europe right now, which seem to be 3 times bigger than last year, in any case, if we take into account the figures for January and February. Schengen is one of the big successes of the European Union, is in danger. I would like your comments on what is your view about the future of the Schengen Treaty.
I'd like to thank you, Excellency, for your presentation. What would you consider to be the consequences of a potential Brexit from the European Union with respect to the question of disintegration? Thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister, it will be rather a comment to what you said concerning Eastern European countries. I personally believe that the fact that they are members of NATO is much more important to Mr. Putin, well, at least military speaking, than the fact that they're in Europe.
Après.
I think it's indeed very difficult to motivate Europeans just on budget, on money, and on things like that. On the other hand, it is true that a lot of talking has been done, in my view, about values, about the achievement of peace, and probably that also, well, needs to be done and redone over time, but I believe that there is a need for a balance of ideal and concrete motivations. The fact is that there has been so far the achievement of one big ideal, peace, so much so that many people in this room, lucky them, probably do not even put in relation the existence of the European Union and the totally abnormal fact that we had 70 years of peace in this continent of ours. I think what we badly need is indeed more economic success, which would not inspire ideals, but would give some more confidence. But at least I believe that when we talk about the economic and fiscal and monetary aspects of the EU, it would be very important, I personally devote a lot of attention to this, to also show the value aspect, the ethical aspect. For example, is the single currency, the euro, a purely technocratic construction, something without a moral value? Not at all, in my view. I remember that I was asked by the President of the Commission in 1997, when I was a commissioner, to receive in Brussels a delegation of Polish bishops, headed by Cardinal Glemp. They had still to decide what position the Church would take on demand for accession or not to the European Union. And those were years when the decision of the Church would have a very, very strong emphasis on the decision of the government. And they, with great candor, asked about the market, the money. Are you a construction for merchants, or do you really cultivate values? And I said, candidly in turn, because I really believe this, that the euro has the appearance of a very sophisticated technocratic construction of practical relevance to people simply because there is no longer the inconvenience of having several currencies. But it has a huge moral value. Why? Because, to me at least, the euro, the currency, is the tip of an iceberg, a single currency, but the whole iceberg below is a whole transformation of the moral relationship between generations. With the euro, as a condition for the euro, came a number of fiscal discipline rules. We may discuss, and we have just discussed, whether they are the good rules or not. But at any rate, in many countries before this, there was total contempt by current politicians in the 70s, in the 80s, in the early 90s, about future generations. The typical politician, the typical government in those years in several countries would say yes to each social request, to each request coming from segments of society, without raising taxes commensurately, and who paid, obviously, through more debt, more deficit and more debt, the future Italians, the future Spaniards would pay. They have come, they now exist. And when I have to explain the huge youth unemployment that we have in Italy, I try to explain that it is not due to the effects of Europe today, as most people believe. It is due largely to the fact that Europe came in rather too late in order to put some respect for future generations in the minds of Italian politicians of those times. So it's not a difficult abstract exercise. I do believe that precisely because Europe is a bit more remote from the electoral cycle than national governments, in their wisdom, member states, decades ago, have given to Europe the responsibility of taking care of aspects, a bit like national parliaments with national central banks. Some things are deposited in hands which are believed to be able to exercise that power with wisdom, which may then be contradicted by facts, but at any rate, this is the principle. So I make an effort, but I'm convinced of this, to see what value content there is in many things that prima facie appear to be technical. And as to the effects on peace, on such an important ideal and concrete value, in my view, there is no reason at all why, should the European Union disappear, the countries even of Western Europe should not go back to their usual favorite distraction of making war to each other in due course. And it's interesting that you say the voice of the top of Europe is seldom heard, even by a Belgian. That is a very important point that you are making again. I believe that the presidents of the European Council, well, we have had two so far, Herman Van Rompuy and now Donald Tusk, the former Polish Prime Minister, and both have interpreted their function mainly as achievers of consensus at the table of 28, and you can believe that it is not easy. more than as spokespersons for Europe. This may have to change, and maybe in some time we will have a US-EU summit where two Donalds speak up. On the future of Schengen, as things stand now, one is likely to be more vocal than the other. I'll not say which one. On the future of Schengen, well, I think we cannot really have a European Union without free movement of people, both for the practical benefits to persons, the ideal behind it, and also for the economic costs that the re-establishment of border controls imply. And here I think that it is one of those cases where the evidence has shown that there is a need for a bit of surrender of sovereignty by the member states, and here I think they might be ready with all the problems and tragedies that have occurred. We need to have a properly exercised EU control of external frontiers, including sea frontiers, which of course is a very difficult problem. The consequences of Brexit in terms of disintegration, very good question. I repeat that I'm convinced that Brexit will not occur because I cannot imagine that Prime Minister David Cameron will not do whatever it takes to avoid going down in books of history as the one who achieved a double disintegration. The double disintegration being the partial disintegration of the European Union because he left, and the partial disintegration of the formerly United Kingdom because Scotland may leave the United Kingdom. So in this moment, I think Scotland is an invaluable insurance police, except that there is some moral hazard there. I have heard now the view, which is probably sophisticated enough, that the hardline Scotsmen, because they do want to leave the UK, particularly if the UK leaves the EU, but at any rate they would like to leave the UK, may vote in favor of Brexit, so that the subsequent request of Scotland to have the referendum for the secession will be even more justified politically and morally. So if the moral hazard conduct prevails, but you seem to be closer to those parts of Europe than I am. What is your view? Sorry?
I'll leave the jury out. The jury out.
Ah, the jury. I thought Germany. The jury out, yes, yes. At any rate, in terms of your precise question, the effects on disintegration, some effects have already been achieved, I believe, because whatever the outcome of the referendum, the precedent of a country getting for its own charismatic, huge prestige, something like a special treatment has been there. And with so many large or particularly little, increasingly nationalistic member states, some of them will think, who am I not to be granted a special status within the European Union. Finally, a very realistic question. Don't you believe that Mr. Putin might be particularly sensitive to whether a Central and Eastern European country is a member of NATO, even more than a member of the EU? Probably yes. But I see a certain technical connection or joint products in a sense, because NATO in turn requires certain degrees of democracies and rule of law, etc. internally, which would have been which would have probably not been so easily adopted by those countries without the aspiration to become members of the EU and then actual members of the EU.
Merci bien. Je crois qu'il nous faut malheureusement conclure. Il y avait des questions encore, certainement nombreuses. Je crois que nous pouvons remercier très vivement notre orateur pour nous avoir fait la démonstration, s'il en était besoin.